just a second. It is over the edge, some, isn't it? I know people are ready to fix it though. Alright. So I think that's about as good as we're going to probably get it. But we got it going, and feel free to have at it. Sorry for the delay.
Breaking all the things.
Break all the things, yes.
All right, hi, my name is Jameson, and thanks for coming to my talk. I'm going to talk to you about phishing in general, and we'll talk about what that means here in a sec. Opinion is my own. I speak for myself and no one else. And what you're about to hear is not bits and bytes. It's all not bits and bytes. It's very non-technical talk. So if that's what you're expecting, you can leave now. I won't be offended. Who am I? I'm an experienced pen tester. I co-founded and now manage a red team at a major financial institution. I'm an experienced fisher. I've fished over 200,000 folks. Published author on SE. Wrote a graduate thesis on the topic. Also, Christian husband, father, Greek geek. All right, so kind of the overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to kind of level set of what I'm going to be talking about, kind of for the rest of the talk. We're talking about phishing awareness, awareness training of your users. We're going to talk about variables that go into that, phishing effectiveness, a little bit of psychology, how to make sure your tests are consistent when you're doing phishing, and then I'll have some tips for building an enterprise phishing program, and I have a kind of a proposal at the end for anybody who's interested. So my first assumption is that you guys already know what phishing is, so I'm not going to go over that. All right, so we know that phishing is basically one of the key ways that folks try and get into businesses. We see that over and over again. You see the number of businesses that have been broken into over the years. The names are kind of a who's who of companies out there. So phishing is usually that initial entry point, specifically spear phishing. It's my personal belief that conducting phishing simulations are really the only way of actually being able to train your users to be resilient against phishing attacks. And I'll talk a little more about that as to why in a second. But this also has the side benefit of testing your users for an assessment purpose, and to knowing how effective your policies and your training is. And I'll go into it training later. So why do I think that this is the best way of training your users? Well, it actually comes from social psychology. So social psychology has talked about illegitimate persuasion for a number of years. And this is, some of you guys heard me talk for old hat, but just want to cover it real quick. There are some ways to instill a resistance to what is called illegitimate persuasion in social psychology. You can pretty much equate phishing and what you're trying to accomplish with phishing to illegitimate persuasion. So here are the following ways of actually being able to instill resistance. One is forewarning. If you tell someone something is coming, they are going to be resistant to it, right? So this is the idea that if I tell you I'm going to fish you tomorrow, you're probably going to be on the lookout for that fish coming tomorrow. This method is actually quite effective. However, it drops off rapidly over time when someone's not exposed to it. The next way of doing this is inoculation. That's basically giving someone a safe dose of the message or the persuasion that you want them to be resistant to. This is the idea of phishing, right? So this is, if we're going to be phishing our users, we're trying to give them that safe dose. Dispelling the illusion of invulnerability. That's basically proving to your users that they are actually vulnerable to these kinds of things, because a lot of times they don't believe that they are. Oh, I'll never click on that, right? So again, these all come from social psychology. So right now, if your company just has WBT, right, so web-based training, you're only covering the first one. You're covering forewarning, and basically that drops off really quickly, pretty quickly. So they might be resistant for maybe 30 to 60 days after they take that training. But how often do folks usually do that training? Anybody?
Yearly, maybe.
Yearly? Maybe once when you join the company sometimes. But if it's annually, that is not nearly good enough for this kind of thing. So the most effective training is actually going to incorporate all of these techniques in order to be effective. So that's kind of the point of this, and the point of the rest of our talk, kind of baseline, is that you should be phishing your users to train your users. And at least the next point, the primary goal of phishing your users should be to train them, not to assess them. And I think that's a very important distinction between training and assessing, right? So if you get into the mindset of that you're going to be assessing your users and you make that the first priority, you can run into trouble with what you're actually doing and how you are conducting your tests. This is actually probably not best for someone who's pen test minded oftentimes, because they just want to get in, they want to get shallow, they want to pop the user, right? And needs to be able to pull back and say, we want to actually train the user. So when you do a campaign like this, an awareness campaign, there are various measures of success. There are click the link, right? So if you send someone a phishing email and there's just a link in there, you can see how many people, what percentage perhaps, click the link. You can have them enter data, right? So if there's like they click the link, it takes them to a browser. There's a place for them to enter data, maybe their username and password. You can see what percentage do that. Open attachment, same deal, a percentage. But there is one small problem with that, is that there are all kinds of variables that go into the success of that message. And if you're not controlling for them, or you're not even aware of some of the variables that go into the success of that message, then you're undermining your own program. You're not getting the ROI, and you might actually be skewing your metrics one way or another, and not impressing your bosses when you try to crank the dial. All right, so can everybody see this okay? So this is a study done for email marketing, but the same concepts apply for phishing. So the best time to phish, everybody see what that is? 11 to 2 p.m. Right? So there is a 14% increase kind of from the average if you send a phish that way. Now imagine that and you skew your stats, right? So if you send a phish at midnight, you're screwing yourself, right? Or you might be giving your management the wrong impression, right? That our users are a lot safer than we actually are. So you need to take this kind of information into account as to when you actually do your campaigns. Another variable, what day? I was actually a little surprised that it was a Friday, but I guess everybody's eager to go home. Everybody's, kind of taking a lax or whatever, but it's Friday and you don't want to send your phish on Wednesday for whatever reason. I actually don't know. I would love to study the psychology and the reasonings behind this, right? So why is Wednesday worse day than Friday? But that's another variable you could take into account. So, where?
Is this for offices that also have flex hours? Is that included in this or no?
No, so this is...
Please repeat the question.
Okay, so the question was, is this for offices that have no flex hours, or... no, this is basically an aggregation of lots and lots of data. So the URL down there, marketingprofs.com, they aggregate literally trillions of email messages and kind of slice and dice it by kind of when it's sent and what happens. So there's no real that kind of slicing and dicing. It's just an aggregation of tons and tons of messages out there. All right, so what's really interesting to me is there are parts of the country, if you look at this, right? So if you look at the states that have a plus 10 or more percentage, they're all pretty much in the deep south. And
Well, Missouri is a show-me state.
except for Georgia, for whatever reason. So, if you want to go fishing, apparently the Deep South is a place to go for both kinds of fishing. All right, so other variables. We haven't even talked about elements that actually are in your fish, right? They're actually elements that are in your message. And these are other variables that go into how successful your fish is, and in fact, that's going to be the primary variable. But I wanted to point out that there are other variables that we should be taking into account. Things like the greeting, how generic or personal your greeting is, what the format of the email is. If it looks ugly, folks probably aren't going to click on it as much. All the elements that go into a standard fish, the from, address, where it's coming, the URL, if it's masked, how well is it masked, what does the URL underneath it look like, and then any attachments, what do they say that they have in them, emotional enticement. So oftentimes, we'll see this in a couple slides, that there's a strong emotional push for a lot of the fishes that get sent out, right? So win this, buy this, you just got hacked. One of my favorites, I included in here. So the problem is if you're running a fishing regularly on the same population, the same fish over and over isn't going to be as effective each time, right? So you can't just take that same template, run it against all of your users 1 month and expect the next month that everybody's going to respond to it the same way. They're going to respond to it, they're not going to click it because they learned the first time, right? So you're going to have to be able to change up the types of fishing that you send, but you also want to make sure and baseline how difficult essentially this fish is, right? So you want to take a variable out of there and be able to compare one fish that you send to another fish, right? And say, these are roughly equivalent, and we're going to be able to send them to our users, and we should expect the same results. So how do you actually measure that? And that's what we're here. So how convincing is this?
Oh God, yeah. People are nuts.
So I saw this on, just as I was kind of finishing up these slides and got a good kick out of it. So iOS 7 has given your iPhone the ability to become waterproof. And this was obviously a fake campaign, but there are now users who are very, very upset because they updated to iOS 7 and dumped wanted to test it apparently, and dumped their phones / devices into the water, and now they're bricked. So, but think about this, right? So there are, for any given pretty much thing that you send out there, this is true of phishing as well, there's going to be some percentage of folks that are always going to click, whether it's super convincing, but think about the elements of this that are kind of convincing, right? So it's got the actual, it looks like an apple, because it is an apple, right? They just took the pictures off the Apple website, photoshopped them, but that lends credibility, that lends authority to the actual fish.
Using the font too.
Same font, same everything, right? So it looks authentic, and there's a lot of, kind of details that your mind picks up on for those cues to understand whether somebody's legitimate or not. Oh. So for the next slide, for the next couple of slides, I want you guys to vote. I'm going to say there's 2 fishes on each one. I'm going to, first one, second one. I want you guys to tell me which ones is most convincing, right? And the first one's going to be pretty easy. All right, so which one's more convincing? The one on the left, raise your hand, or the one on the right? Okay, why? Right? I'm sorry?
HTML?
Okay, it's HTML. Anybody else?
I don't know anyone in Nigeria.
You don't know anyone in Nigeria? That's good.
Too much to read. TLDR.
Anything else? I mean, this is pretty classic, right? So it's a Nigerian scam. The response rate that's really, really absurdly low. The next one looks at least somewhat legitimate. Has HTML, has a lot of elements that are going into this. We'll kind of analyze that in a sec. All right. So for this one, which one is most convincing and why? And if you can't, let me know if you can't see it. If you can't see it, that's okay. Give me a second to read it. All right, so one on the left is more convincing, one on the right. Okay, so consensus is the one on the right. I would also say that the one on the right is most convincing. Now why? Someone who said it was on the right, why is that?
It's very well formed.
Okay.
And it has that little lock there.
It has a lock, right? That's secure. Sorry?
It's got a logo of some sort.
Right, so it's got an official logo.
Once like somebody you know, because
The small print on the bottom.
Privacy
Yeah.
policy.
The small print on the bottom, we'll get to that in a sec, but that's really irony. But
Colors who you are.
yeah, it looks like it came from somebody you're doing business with.
Right.
basically.
But it's set on Friday.
So I would agree with the consensus that the one on the right is more convincing for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about that in a sec. All right, so let's look at each of the elements kind of in here, right, and talk about the good and the bad elements in there. So for the U.S. Airways one, the email address kind of looks legitimate, right? U.S. Airways does send out things like this. They do send out reminders that pay to check in or that kind of stuff. The graphics and format look okay, and the dates at least correlate, so it's at least 2 days before. So if you look at the date on the email, and you look at the day that they're supposed to be flying, it's at least it's about right. So the bad is, I'm not about to take a trip, right? So not everybody who's going to get this may be on their way to take a trip, and for that reason alone, a lot of people are going to ignore it. There's no names, there's really nothing in here to convince me that it's targeted at me, that they're talking about me. And the ugly of this is that people still fall for this a lot when you do phishing type of campaigns. All right, so the next other one. So this one has a nice hook, and it's an emotional hook. And if you pick up on that, right? So wait, I didn't actually change my email address. Who has access to my account now, right? So you put someone into essentially a panic mode, which if you study social psychology, you understand that that's called a strong effect. It's called basically the emotions override judgment at that point, and you can entice someone to click something that they may not otherwise click. So you put something almost immediately in a panic mode. Again, the graphics and format look real. There's a little bit of irony here. The links down at the bottom actually do go to the phishing page for American Express that says, you can't read it, but it says, help stop spam and in phishing, report this and click here and they left it in there. They left the actual link in there. And the link looks like it's going to a legitimate site. So if you look at the link without actually hovering over it, it looks legitimate, right? So the bad, it's a generic greeting. If you're a card holder with American Express, you can probably expect that they're going to know your name, and they might actually address you by name. I know a lot of companies do actually say, we will address you by name in correspondence that we send to you, and for exactly that reason, so that folks don't get had. You may not be a card holder. If you're not a card holder, again, same thing with U.S. Airways, you're probably going to ignore this. There's more likelihood that you're a card holder than you're taking a trip in the next 2 days, but there's still that possibility. The email address is kind of funky if you look at it, so when you're examining the from address, it looks kind of funky. All right, so, and then people fall for this in droves as well. All right, so what makes a phish convincing? And this is kind of the root of it, right? So what are the elements that go into a phish that help make it convincing? I added some here. I would like to hear from you guys if you have any other ideas. But recipients need to trust the sender, right? So there's an established trust that I believe that this email that's coming to me is actually from who it says it's from. There's some kind of effective subject line to actually get me to open the message at all, right? So it has to have some kind of enticing message in the subject line. It has to sound authoritative. It has to look legitimate, right? It has to have the kind of right text and right feel. Think about the logos that go into it. Think about the wording that goes into it, no misspellings. It has to offer something, right? So as an enticement, it has to elicit an emotional response, usually for a phish. Not necessarily, but usually. Any others? Anybody else?
Well, to the point about whether or not you're taking a trip or a car, just how relevant is it?
Sure, it has to be, that's great, it has to be relevant to the user. Sure.
I find the Komodo $2 SSL certs to be quite effective. If that link has the padlock, they're like, all right, I'm good.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
It has to not be one of the, oh no, these are all phishing scam emails, like the Nigerian 419 scam.
Sure.
Because everybody knows, oh, that's bullshit.
Right, so it can't be a well-known one, usually, although you'd be surprised.
I'm scared.
Setting an expectation with the user really helps a lot. So if you want to open a poison document, let's say, send them an email letting them know, hey, I'm on the road, but I'll send you this document.
Right.
And then actually send the document later on. Well, that's drastically increasing chance.
A double barrel, right? So
Yes.
you send, or even call, right? So if you want to be really insidious, you call the user, say, hey, I'm about to send you something, it's blah, 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 I have some sad story, I need you to open this, make an adjustment, blah, 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 and then you send it, off they go. But the email, pre-email, hey, also works as well. Start in the back.
It actually made it through the spam filter.
I'm sorry?
It actually beat the spam filter because if your users aren't even getting any spam,
Sure.
when they get something,
Okay, sure.
Supporting websites and other stuff that you can put up, so if they do click the links, it looks legit and they're able to see this is a real website.
Sure, it has to tell a good story, right? And it has to be a believable story that kind of builds on itself. Any others? Sir?
Pretty much have to get your message across in like a sentence or two at the most, because they won't read any more than that.
Right, right. It has to hook
Too
them
much
quickly.
text and they'll just ignore it.
Sure. Yep.
Just to dovetail on that, the pretext has to be pretty doggone good.
Right, the pretext has to, I mean, there is, again, just telling a story, right? And you want to entice them. All right, so we're going to take a slight detour. Again, social psychology, principles of persuasion, right? So, those of you see some nods. Yeah. So reciprocity, right? So this is, anybody not familiar with the principles of persuasion? All right, okay. We'll go through this quickly then. So reciprocity is basically, I pat your back, you pat mine, and that's, and you can get someone to be very complicit that way. Authority is always a nice way of persuading someone to do something. Liking, becoming their friend, or having something in common, or feeling that there is some level of familiarity there. Scarcity, which is always fun, right? So, can you imagine how well, the gold iPhone, no one can find those right now. So I would create, a Phish based on the gold iPhone. Win a gold iPhone, or, get a free gold iPhone, or whatever, right? Because there's a scarcity element to it. Commitment consistency. If someone tells you they're going to do something, you can usually get them to do something larger, but in the same realm, right? So a famous example of this is where they had folks put a sign in their yard, and it was an ugly sign. And the folks that they got to put in the sign in their yard the most were the people that they had come to the week before and got them to put a little postcard that was about this big up in their window. So being able to get them to do something little like that significantly changed how many folks were willing to put the sign in their yard. Now you could also kind of argue that they're also just more gullible and more likely to do it in the first place. So, but that's another example. All right, and social proof. So this is the lemming theory, right? So if I see everybody else doing it, I'm going to do it too. I want one too. Anyway, all of these elements should be incorporated, or not all of them, but some of these elements should be incorporated into any good Phish, right? So you're actually trying to persuade someone to do something, and so your Phish, your message should include some of these elements. All right, so giving Phish a grade is kind of what I had an idea of. All right, so how do you compare two Phish and be able to tell that they're approximately going to be equivalent? As we already stated, there's a lot of variables that go into this, so no two Phish are actually going to be exactly alike unless they're the same email. However, you can take elements and replicate them across different Phishes and get an approximate equivalency. Some common ways of increasing the difficulty of a Phish, well-formatted emails. a personal versus strong. We went over that already, and then a strong motion to pull it. If you take the elements of that and kind of grade them, so all the elements that go into a fish, right? So if you think about the header, the elements that I listed prior, all those kind of elements that you guys gave me some extra ones. Take those elements and kind of grade them and determine how effective they're going to be based on some criteria. Oftentimes it's, and this is highly subjective. But what it does is, if you're the same person creating the fish, that same subjectiveness should be applied throughout different campaigns, right? So, for example, every fish that I make is going to be subjective to my own thoughts and whims. Mick might have a different scale, essentially. Some of the other guys might have different scales. So that's a way to try and grade a fish and be able to compare them to each other. All right, so building a fishing campaign. All right, so I wanted to talk about how to actually build a campaign at your enterprise, right? So if you want to build an enterprise fishing campaign, what do? So you get senior management. That's got to be step one. If it's not, you'll probably fall on your face, right? Also, dovetail. It's very important. Dovetail it with your information security program. You already have one. For any given size company, you're probably going to have an information security awareness program. Make sure that this program dovetails nicely with that program in order to make sure that the goals are the same, right? So and that they're talking to the same sheet of music, essentially. Tell your users you're going to fish them. This is important as well, because it activates that whole forewarning thing, right? I told you I am going to fish you, and then fish them. So it layers the methods of instilling that resistance. Fish them regularly, not just one done and you're done. Quarterly is a decent pace, semi-annually even, but also ramp up the difficulty gradually. All right, so give them some easy ones first, right, and then get them used to the idea of that you are going to be fishing them and testing, and then crank the dial, and then gradually crank how hard the fish is up. This actually does a couple of things for you. One, it makes your users more resilient, but also helps your management understand that they're getting their ROI essentially out of their users in this campaign. Offer rewards. This is an interesting offer rewards potentially for reporting a fish, for sending one in. Positive feedback and positive reinforcement is actually far more effective over time than negative feedback. So if you kind of make it not fun for them, but reward them for it, they're actually going to be more vigilant and stay on. Go ahead.
So free lunch for turning in fish?
So I've seen a couple of things. I've seen like a company that had like a little, that had basically a competition to see who could report the most type of things, and they had a doll that went around, and that was kind of a bragging right thing. I don't know about free lunch. That could get expensive pretty quickly, but something that's small but meaningful. A card even, or an email, or email to them and their manager that says, hey, this guy spotted the fish. That's very low overhead, it's very low cost, but it actually does make a difference.
That's what I was going to say, like an attaboy does a real good job at that.
Yeah, it's free, essentially. It takes 10 minutes, and then you're accomplishing great things with your users. Go ahead.
Or a reward email to them that's actually a fish.
Right, exactly. Oh, yeah. Well, that's a little cruel. And see if they report it.
One thing I've seen where people performance reviews could be something that as a positive thing.
Sure, and you can include it in some kind of performance review. So successfully reported all the fishes we sent him this year, or something.
Going back a little bit, but why should we even forewarn? Don't you think it would get better results and?
Again, this is not an assessment activity, and that is the key, right? This is not an assessment activity, this is a training activity. And we are warning them because we want them not to be vigilant against our fishes, because we want them to be vigilant against the bad guys' fishes. And if we tell them, right, they are going to be more vigilant, period, against ours or anybody else's. So that's the reason.
Well, I was just going to say that you can also frame it like there's going to be a fishing exercise, but also be aware that there's ongoing phishing attacks. And so that you're setting them up for success both against that test, but also the everyday unauthorized test that the bad guys are doing.
Right, because ultimately, the whole point of this is that your users don't click that malicious link that comes in and compromises and leads to a major compromise that ends up your company on CNN, right? So, go ahead.
If you want them ahead of time, it also gets rid of that gotcha mentality.
Oh.
That I think, so they don't hate you as much.
Right, that's also true, because once you get into the gotcha mentality, right, users start to become, well, I'll get into that in a little while. I'll show you some user responses. And limit negative outcomes for egregious, go ahead.
Is there any sort of study that sort of looks at incentivizing them in terms of giving them a reward when they do find a fish or report it, as opposed to some sort of negative feedback, like some sort of negative response?
The studies that I'm aware of aren't specific for fishing, but there are lots and lots and lots of studies for 16 years plus now that show that positive feedback, positive reinforcement has a far greater influence on someone's behavior than negative reinforcement. And the studies on that are real clear. So this is the next point, right? So limited negative outcomes, except maybe in egregious behavior. If you have one person that clicks on every single one that you said for a year, okay, maybe we need to have a conversation with them. Or take away their internet access.
Just because of the environment we're in right now, I actually save up my swag from conferences to give away as prizes.
Nice. That's a great idea.
So I don't have a budget to do it, so.
Great. All right, and then don't give up is the other one I would say. Changing cultures take time and effort, and ironically enough, that's the actual meaning of social engineering. So if you look up that phrase, how it was used prior to 1995, that is what it means, is to move and change a culture over time. All right, so consistent tests. How do you make sure that you're having consistent tests? Reduce and/or account for your variables, and we talked about that, right? So if you start one campaign at midnight and you start the next one at 11 a.m., we saw how big a difference that is. You're going to get a 30% swing just on that, right? And that's probably not the greatest of ideas. And you're going to see, oh, well, all of our users are now clicking emails. No, you didn't account for your variable. Know when you're changing the difficulty of your fish and why, right? So, okay, so we've seen a gradual decrease is really the reason why you should be. We've seen a decrease in our users' clicks over time. It's time to crank the dial a little bit. That rate might go up, right? But that's okay. We want to drive it back down. So we just want to make sure that understand why, and make sure you communicate that with whoever is viewing your metrics, right? So if they see, oh, by the way, this fish in Q1 is 10 percentage points higher than the fish that we did in Q4. Why? Well, this is why. So make sure that's communicated as well. That's quick. Important caveats to phishing as an enterprise. You will never get to zero. You will always have someone who clicks links. Always. There's going to be users that turn over. There's going to be folks that don't pay attention to training. There's folks on a bad day. Maybe they actually are going on that flight tomorrow, right? So, in general, from what I've seen, an under 10% response rate is actually pretty good. Under 5% is awesome. and probably acceptable. If you hit under 5%, you can probably feel really good about yourself and your enterprise because you reduce the overall attack surface. Sure, there are some users that still click, but you have other controls on top of that, right? And that's why you have other controls up there. Use your users as sensors. Don't tell them to delete the link. Tell them to forward it to somebody, and then be able to monitor that email box. And that way you'll know when your users are under attack. And you'll probably be able to find out if a broad set of users are under attack, and that might trigger other things that you might want to go look into. All right, more tips. Remember this email?
Yep.
All right, so slightly larger. Notice the email address in there? That one? If you send an email like this that has I changed your email to an email address, make sure you've registered that email address. I've gotten some interesting, I did that for some of the campaigns that we've done, and I've gotten some really interesting emails to that email address of really irate users that are threatening, confused, all kinds of things. But make sure that you own that email address so that message isn't going to some other user on the internet. And for a very good reason. That could end up with your company being splashed over all over pages too, right? So someone reports that and so that's a good tip there. All right, so the last thing I have is basically a call to the community, and I did this without actually looking at the DerbyCon schedule, but there are two frameworks that are being released here at DerbyCon for phishing, open source phishing platforms. So I'm going to go talk to those guys, but I actually want to build something like Security Onion for a phishing platform. So a distro that has basically everything you would need to do phishing campaigns in it. If you're interested in doing something like that, there's my Twitter handle. We get together. And I'm actually going to hit up the folks as well that are already releasing frameworks. That's it for me.
Can you go back one slide?
Thank you. That's it for me. Appreciate your attendance and participation. Any questions?
So with that Amex email, what would the downside have been of them forging an actual Amex, an actual email from AmericanExpress.com? Would there be a downside? Would it be more easily put into a spam filter?
So you could certainly do that. Sometimes, depends on where you're sending it, but may or may not get through your filter if the from doesn't match the SPF correct, doesn't match where it's actually coming from. So there are some caveats to that, but you can do that. Your use may vary. Any other questions?
You had talked about kind of scoring the fishes based on the attributes you listed. Have you actually applied that a little bit, and does that correlate with the click percentage?
Yes and yes. So we have done things like that, and yes, it actually does correlate. It took a little while to get going. That's why it's subjective per person, essentially, is the caveat. Go ahead.
Being a major financial institution.
Oh, this is
How do the phishing rates compare outside of the country?
No comment.
So how are you letting the user know that they've been phished? Do you immediately let them know this was part of the test?
Yeah, absolutely. So that I didn't even mention that, I guess, but there should be a landing page that says, "Hey, this was part of, it's okay. This was part of a phishing campaign. Here's what you should have done. Here's the elements that were in the email that maybe you could have picked up on, right?" And that gives them that aha moment, because it's a teaching moment essentially for them, where you can do that third one. So we talked about inoculation, we talked about forewarning, and dispelling that illusion of vulnerability. So that landing page is important for that dispelling the illusion of vulnerability, and then using that to instill the resistance. That's a good question.
I think I know one of the frameworks you were talking about. What was this site? Can you name the two frameworks that you
So
recommend?
I'd have to look at the DerbyCon schedule.
Okay, sure.
But there's one being released tomorrow and one on Sunday. And they're actually two. One's PHP based and one looks like it wasn't. And I was just looking at the schedule like, oh. So. Go ahead.
one of the biggest challenges I get from clients, especially whenever we do phishing campaigns, is that sometimes we'll get management claiming, look, you're debasing our users' trust in us, the executive team or the management team. Sometimes we'll do things like, hey, if you go and donate $5 to this charitable website, you'll get to wear jeans on Friday. Or if you complete this tech survey, you'll get a $50 gift card from Amex.
As your Phish?
As my Phish.
Okay.
How can you overcome some of those objections to because a legitimate criminal is going to rely on some of those techniques in order to
Sure.
bust the users. So how do you overcome that objection with executive teams and management teams that are, that are saying that, like, look, you're just teaching our users not to trust us when we send out stuff, like.
I've had that argument, and there are a variety of ways. Usually, frankly, I don't do stuff like that because I'll make some concessions. And what we do is we base it on real stuff, right? So that has been our best way of getting around that argument. We have seen this kind of Phish come into our organization, literally, all right? And then we take that template and we replicate it in a way that's reasonable, and then send it back out as a test. But that has been one of our best ways of counter-arguing, look, this is stuff that's actually coming into our servers.
I guess I'd have to say, you'd have to tie that back to policy, and the policy would have to be, those kind of awards would only be given at meetings where they have a face-to-face meeting with their manager. We basically have to change policy at that point, because you're right, you are undermining the trust between employees and the manager. If they send out emails, and some emails they can trust, and other emails they can't trust.
But that is your job, is to undermine that trust.
Yes, right,
Your
but
job
hold on.
Well, your job is to train them in a realistic way.
So today is the first time I've heard that, and I like that paradigm, but previously it's always been assessment-based. So
Sure.
I like the idea of using
The employee's not going to trust anymore.
Okay, but here's the thing. You're sending out emails that say, hey, if you do this, the company will let you do that. None of the email examples he gave were representing his actual company, and that's probably your biggest hurdle. Because, sending out from, Amex or sending out from somebody else or a third party, that's fine. But if you're not expecting internal phishing to happen inside, then that's different.
So,
Say that for your executives,
just to tie in a little bit
for your
to that,
spear phishing.
Sands did a similar kind of talk like you're talking about right now with Lance Fittner, and he said, essentially, you have to build in at least 2 to 3 ways that an employee can reasonably identify a Phish for them to feel like they haven't been cheated.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and goes back to the landing page idea, right? So you'd be able to point out on that landing page, it says, here are the elements that were tip-offs that this was a Phish, and be able to point those out to the users.
It's
Because
basically not fair to give them a perfect Phish.
right,
It's not fair because
and certainly not the first time.
they can't trust anything. Any employee, any manager will tell you, an employee can't spend 3 minutes looking at an email headers to figure out if it's a legit email. That's just not cost effective.
So, and that's the idea behind ramping it up over time, right? So send the easy ones first, and make that kind of a baseline, and then ramp that. And it should take you literally years probably to get to that ultimate, the godfish, right?
You're always going to get new employees, so you're always going to
Right, you're going to have turnover.
But having a framework to track that turnover would be great.
Yes, it would be. Go ahead.
Do you ever make use of outside websites, buy yourself a website with an email to really be an outside agency getting in there, or do you just do everything internal?
I think both paradigms can work, frankly, as long as the elements that you would teach your users to look for are in the Phish, right? So, because this is not to be something you're trying to bypass your controls. This should not be something you're trying to send illegitimately, right? You should be either whitelisting whatever's sending the email on your behalf, or you can send it from inside, and either way will work as long as the elements, right? So especially like when you train folks, they look for the URL. And if you send someone a URL that says your actual company name.com, and that's like the legitimate, if it's a legitimate link, then you've basically duped your users unfairly, essentially. So you probably have to have some external landing page to point to, or a domain that they're unfamiliar with. But I don't see why you couldn't send the emails from inside.
So you never bought an external page yourself, though? You kept everything internal there?
No comment on that item.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Spearfish, after you've ramped up over time, you start really doing very, very specialized, where you've done research on the people, spearfishing against like execs and high-end or high-value people?
I would treat that more as one-offs than you've built up such a resistance across your user base that you start researching your user base. For a user base as large as what we have, that wouldn't be feasible. And so I would use that as more one-offs in very particular situations that you want to test, like maybe executives, but, I'm sorry?
Have you done that?
No comment.
Okay.
Anybody else? Thank you very much for your time, appreciate it.